moderate a panel session with a special focus on conflict. So I will ask the panelists if you can please come on video, those of you who are connected. So we have Katerina, Lotta, Chen. Perfect. Okay. Yes, so I am delighted to introduce a great list of speakers for this panel on gender-based violence in conflict. Although I have to say that, of course, I would much rather prefer not to have to moderate this panel, and I'm sure none of the panelists will take this personally, because the decision to add this panel to the initial conference plan came after the war in Ukraine erupted. We had already planned a conference on domestic violence, but then given who we are at SIDA and the Free Network and the Frogi Network, we thought that we cannot have a conference on domestic violence without trying at least to reflect on how the conflict is impacting and what are the special ways in which the conflict is impacting Ukrainian women, which we know is a problem, it's an issue based on research and experience from previous conflicts. And our decision to add this panel to the conference actually came as the first news. So we're starting emerging of episodes of rapes, sexual assault committed in the immediate area of conflict from the Russian military, as well as across the border in the countries where Ukrainian women were seeking refuge. And at the same time, we know that already before February 2022, both Amnesty International and the US State Department have documented episodes of sexual violence against women from armed actors, both from the Russian and Ukrainian military in the conflict region of Donetsk and Luhansk, which speaks to the tragedy that people in this contact area, so-called contact area, are experiencing. So today, during this panel, we will try to learn a bit more about what is happening, what we might expect to happen, since it's also very hard to learn now about the facts on the ground. Probably we'll learn more later in the post-conflict period, unfortunately. What are the factors behind sexual gender-based violence during a conflict, and whether there is possibly an intervention that local governments and the international community also can take to potentially mitigate the risks that the Ukrainian women are facing right now. And we also hope that this reflection can somehow inform efforts that will be made after the conflict in order to assist survivors of violence, as well as to hold those that are who are responsible to account, which we think is very important, given that in nearly all the previous conflicts, if not all of them, the actors that sit at peace negotiation tables are mostly or exclusively men. And given the first sector, given what we've seen in the first set of attempts to negotiate in the current conflict, we're seeing that this time is no exception. So to discuss all this, we brought here virtually a great set of panelists with very different sets of expertise and backgrounds, which we think will make for a good discussion. So I will briefly introduce each of the panelists to you before starting the discussion. Of all the panelists, I will proceed in alphabetical order, and Bilge Erten is the one panelist all of you probably know of at this point in this conference. So rather than giving again a presentation, I will repeat something that Bilge already hinted to during his presentation, which is that as an associate editor of feminist economics, Bilge is actually co-editing a special issue with the title Conflicts, Disasters and Violence Against Women. So if you're listening to this panel, most likely you will be interested in reading this special issue once it's out, but also you might want to send a contribution to the issue. So probably you should get in touch with Bilge if you're interested in knowing more. After Bilge, we will hear from Katerina Mantouvalou, who is Director of European Policy at ICF. Katerina has a PhD in Political Science from UCL and leads research and evaluations in gender equality and human rights for the European Commission and its agencies, the World Bank and the United Nations. Then next we will listen to Chen Reis, who is a clinical associate professor and the director of the Humanitarian Assistance Program at the University, at the School of International Study at the University of Denver. Chen's practice and research focus on gender-based violence in humanitarian settings. As in many of our events, we are delighted to have representatives from the institution that provides funding and much more to our FROGE initiative, the Swedish Development Agency, SIDA. From SIDA, we are lucky to have with us Lotta Sylwander, who is a SIDA representative for gender equality and has been the UNICEF representative in Ukraine. Lotta has championed the causes of women and children in many positions across many regions in the world, so I'm sure she will have some interesting thoughts to bring to this discussion here today. And last but not least, we welcome Leena Vastapuu from the Swedish Defense University. Leena research concentrates on the life trajectories of women and girls as military combatants. She is the author of Liberia's Women Veterans, War Roles and Reintegration, a book on women as combatants. And in addition to academia, Leena has worked in the areas of development cooperation and consultancy. Most recently, she was the planning and reporting officer at the EU Civilian Crisis Management Mission in the Central African Republic. So now I think I will start trying to get the conversation going, inviting each of the panelists to give us some thoughts about the interactions between gender and conflict and sexual violence and related themes, and I'll have some questions for them. And then after their initial contribution, I will have a set of follow-up questions, and I will also open the floor to everyone here in Stockholm or online who wants to contribute to the discussion and stimulate further thoughts from our panelists. And just to bridge the session this morning on domestic violence and the keynote lecture to this panel, I will invite Bilge first to, if possible, just elaborate a bit more on something that she already discussed a bit in her keynote address, which is to what extent the conflict can heighten the risk of domestic violence. What are the factors, given what we know about the determinants of the incidence of domestic violence, what are factors that can play a particular role in a conflict and that we should be paying attention to? Bilge, you can speak for as long as you want, of course, but we'll try to keep these initial interventions relatively short so that we make this a bit more interactive. So I will aim at maximum, say, 7 minutes, and then you will have more opportunities to interact and talk. Thank you.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Thank you so much for the great introduction. And I think, you know, as we were thinking about, so the sort of, I think the first points you were asking me to address were so thinking about how does conflict heighten the immediate risk of domestic violence and what can be its determinants. So as an immediate risk, I think we can think about many different factors. So one of them is that conflict tends to increase the stress levels and can create actually trauma for those exposed to violent events. And we know that increased stress, and in some more extreme cases, the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, tends to actually reduce impulse control. And just through those mental health channels, it can increase the risk of domestic violence perpetration. And more generally, we can also say that negative emotional shocks can worsen relationship quality during the conflict. and therefore lead to also more violent relationships overall. So the evidence from literature that we know, for example, there was a paper by Jesur and Sabia in 2016. What they looked at was sort of assignment to combat during the global war on terrorism. This random assignment, they could then look at the returning soldiers from combat and see what happened to their relationships. And what they found was that there was a significant increase in the probability of intimate partner violence and child abuse for those soldiers who were assigned to conflict zones to fight actively in the war. And so this one set of evidence that essentially we know is that this like wartime exposure, seeing all the violence and also having the PTSD issues definitely tends to increase violence in relationships. A second channel we can think about is that conflict has adverse consequences on labor market outcomes. And it tends to, as you have seen in the Ukrainian conflict, completely stop the economy. And therefore people no longer have income, and this negative income shock at the household level can really increase stress, and therefore also lead to more violence within a relationship. Furthermore, conflict can often increases substance abuse, such as alcohol use, but the use of other substances like drugs, and which also reduce emotional regulation. And through that channel, it can also increase the risk of domestic violence perpetration. Another set of aspect of conflict is that, of course, you might lose your loved ones. And these feelings of grief, again, actually exacerbate the mental distress that families experience. And that can, again, lead to more violence within the household. And lastly, as a separate channel, we can also imagine that during conflict situations, families stay in shelters for prolonged periods. And we talked about this during COVID a lot, when you're locked down in a shelter, in a place with a potential perpetrator, then actually just the exposure to potential perpetrator, because the time you spend with them mechanically actually increases the likelihood of domestic violence. Even if nothing happened, just being locked down in the same space also increases domestic violence. So clearly all of these channels, whether it's the mental health channel, the labor market channel, substance abuse, loss of loved ones, or the being locked into a same shelter for prolonged periods of time, all of them point to the same direction, that there's going to be a further domestic abuse. And that's something we hear less about, because we are much more concerned about the sexual violence happening in the conflict zones, which are obviously extremely important. But I think when we think about domestic violence, which is sort of more hidden, more people think of it more private, we also should be thinking about it actually more, because we know that it has very negative consequences, not just for the victims, but also for the children and just society overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Bilge. That's a great way of introducing the panel, because there is plenty to discuss, starting from what you said. One aspect that we think might be relevant for Ukraine, for instance, is that in the current law regulating domestic violence in Ukraine, which has been expanded in the last couple of years, there is a limit of 6 months to prosecute the crime. And at a time when the normal functioning of institutions, as much as the economy is suspended, this limit might be critical in actually giving almost a sense of impunity, actual or perceived, that also, it has been pointed out, could heighten the risk of domestic violence during conflict. And Amnesty International, documenting the increase in domestic violence in the Donetsk and Luhansk region, has specifically suggested that this sense of impunity might also be a critical factor. Which leads me to a discussion also, to open a discussion on the difficulties of measuring, of assessing the prevalence, pervasiveness of domestic violence, which is, as we saw from the presentation this morning, a problem in normal times, the conflict can also aggravate this issue. And on this aspect, I think Katerina might have some contribution to offer, because Katerina is a specialist on data issues. So Katerina, maybe you can just tell us a bit more, what are the data issues regarding gender-based violence? And maybe you can also tell us in what way the conflict makes these issues particularly challenging.
Thank you very much, Pamela, for inviting me to this conference, and good afternoon, everyone. I have also a couple of slides, so let me quickly try to see if I can share my screen. So, okay, great. So thanks again very much for inviting me to the conference and this panel discussion. So the topic of the conference is the topic of the conference on the socioeconomic context of domestic violence is very important, as we also saw significant increases in case of domestic violence during the pandemic. The war in Ukraine then also shed light to the risks faced by specific groups of women who are affected by military conflict, including refugee women, as we have been discussing throughout the day. If we move to the next slide, please. So in this short intervention, I will talk about data availability in relation to violence against women in general, and those affected by military conflict more specifically. Looking at data availability is really important first step in order to understand the scale of the problem and develop appropriate policies to combat this form of violence against women and assistant victims. Bilge already gave a fantastic keynote presentation and covered significant issues in relation to data availability and underlying factors. In this intervention, I will focus only on the European context and stress the need to improve data availability in this area. So I will briefly talk about the statistical database that EIGE has, the European Institute for Gender Equality, EIGE, has developed, and present what data are available and what are the limitations. Then I will touch upon recent policy developments and see the extent to which they can address the issues that we face. Next slide, please. Sorry, next one. Sorry, there was a bit of, yeah, this one, exactly. So if you click, you will see also the sources. Exactly, thank you. So what data are available to shed light on the scale of gender-based violence in the European Union? The European Institute for Gender Equality has developed a gender statistics database. This is a one-stop source for all gender statistics at member state level and at European level, making data searches fast and easy. In total, the database has more than 1,500 indicators for different forms of violence, for different aspects that are relevant to gender equality. So the sources of data that are available in the database are mainly three. First of all, we can have data collected directly by the European Institute for Gender Equality from EU and national sources on gender-based violence and women and men in decision-making. Then we have indicators computed and collected by the European Institute for Gender Equality itself from a range of sources. We have data from EIGE's Gender Equality Index, as well as data, monitoring data on progress made in different areas of concern of the Beijing Platform for Action. Last, we have indicators collected from EU-level data sources, such as Eurostat, Eurofound, the Fundamental Rights Agency, etc. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, available data in EIGE's Gender Statistics database cover also, among others, violence against women. And these data on violence against women are presented in a separate entry point of the database, which is organized by form of violence, such as physical, sexual, psychological, economic violence, intimate partner violence, female genital mutilation and trafficking. There are also data available on attitudes and perceptions of violence, as well as on support services and statistical capacity. In total, there are 130 indicators in that entry point on violence against women, all of them focusing on data that are in the European Union, available in the European Union. These indicators that are available on violence against women give us a good overview of the phenomenon in different countries of the European Union. But the main issue that we face is that when we look especially at different forms of violence against women, data are not comparable, and neither are they comprehensive. Hence, the European Institute for Gender Equality has made significant efforts to collect comparable national administrative data on intimate partner violence, working closely with national authorities from the police, judiciary, and statistical offices. This is an ongoing effort that the Institute has been making since 2017, and we are getting closer to having more comparable data in the area, but it is a long and difficult process. If we move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So a question that arises, of course, is that are data available, correctly disaggregated, to provide a clear overview of the number of women affected by gender-based violence in military conflict in the European Union? If someone wanted to research more specifically on this issue and how many women are victims of gender-based violence in military conflict then need support in Europe, data availability is very, very scarce. It is very difficult to say how many women in Europe need support, what type of issues they face, and what would be the most effective way of assisting them. Under the separate entry point of the database of the Beijing Platform for Action, which is a branch in the database, we have information on Area E of the Beijing Platform for Action, which is on women and armed conflict. In the database, it is acknowledged that women are affected by armed conflict in a variety of ways. They can be victims of gender-based violence, peace and reconstruction actors and combatants, or members of the armed forces, volunteers or not. It is also mentioned in the database that women and children constitute some of 80% of the world's millions of refugees and other displaced persons, including internationally displaced persons. In addition, it is recognized that women often become caregivers. Conflict unexpectedly cast as a sole manager of households, sole parents or caregivers. However, when it comes to data availability, there is no systematic effort to measure progress in this area, and no data are available in the database in relation to the EU. In fact, improving EU-wide monitoring data in relation to Area E of the Beijing Platform for Action was one of EIGE's recommendations in the 25-year review of the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. Using the term refugee, one could try to see if there are more relevant data available in the database, but none of the data available specifically focus on women in military conflict. So we have 3 indicators that are generally related to refugees, but these are more contextual indicators. The war in Ukraine brought the conflict in Europe. It also brought the issue of violence against women affected by conflict at the forefront of the agenda. However, with this short intervention, I want to highlight the need to make more systematic efforts to improve our understanding of the scale of violence against women in military conflicts and improve our efforts to support them. So this is all I had for now. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And yeah, we will definitely get back with some questions, but I think it's almost natural to bring from your talk my question to Chen, because you, Katerina, mentioned the risk of sexual violence against refugees. And Chen, a couple of weeks into the war, has written a piece in The Conversation where she basically claimed that Ukrainian women are escaping violent conflict, but they might encounter still more violence in their host countries, which is the reason why I invited Chen to participate to this panel. So Chen, maybe you can tell us a bit more why you felt you had to warn against this risk, and what do we know about women as a refugee and sexual violence.
Great, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I apologize, I wasn't able to listen in because of the time zone issue to earlier parts of this really important conference. And I hope to see the recording when it's available. But if I repeat anything that's already been said, please see it as a reinforcement of really important points. So I want to start by saying that what really motivated me to write the piece is that I've been working now on issues around the impacts of conflict and displacement on women and children for over 20 years now. And, you know, seeing crises happen in real time as years go by, and seeing that there are things that we know happen, and yet they're not addressed until they either get highlighted, and even then they're under addressed, or that they're sort of relegated to something that we address after we deal with what is considered to be the most urgent or immediate needs. And you know, those of us that work on violence against women know that that's a false way of looking at it, that it's really important to address these concerns, these risks, and the immediate needs of those affected by violence immediately, rather than relegated to something that we think about in the future, a future that sometimes doesn't actually happen. So I'm gonna, in this very brief intervention, I'm going to speak primarily about the risks to women and girls, but I want to acknowledge that men, boys can also experience sexual violence, as well as those who are not on the gender binary, and their needs and the appropriate responses and prevention efforts for different parts of the population might differ based on their particular situations. And I also want to recognize that in the context of a crisis, like a conflict or displacement, sexual violence, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence is just one of, unfortunately, many violations and abuses that an individual can experience and often does experience. And it's, even though we are focusing here on one form of violence, it's really important to consider when addressing the needs of those who've experienced it or preventing further violence from happening, that we think about the totality of people's experiences, rather than just reducing them to one violation, which may not even necessarily be the one that is most immediately harmful to them as they perceive it. So, and the one other thing that I want to open with is that there are differential risks based on various characteristics that a person might have. You know, we know that adolescent girls, for example, have particular risks because of their age. I mentioned gender identity. We need to think about sexual orientation, disability status, depending on the context. All of those and the intersection of those with other factors may make some people more vulnerable than others to specific forms of violence. So women and girls face a range of risks of violence as they flee a conflict, as well as once they are able to get some sort of refuge in a safer location, and safer in quotes. And that includes, for example, sexual exploitation and abuse by those who are claiming to help them. And that could include formal aid workers, or as I highlighted in my conversation piece. It can also include the more informal volunteers that we see being very much involved, in particular in the response to the crisis in Ukraine. Trafficking is another possible risk that I'm not going to go too much into, but it is one that exists, and in particular for children, as well as for women. And I want to focus a little bit on the domestic violence or intimate partner violence component. It's likely to be one of the most common forms of violence, gender-based violence that women experience in crises. There's a systematic review of prevalent studies of gender-based violence in complex emergencies. And as Katerina pointed out, there isn't a lot of data, and we can have a bigger conversation about that. But this systematic review by Lindsay Stark and Alistair Agar found that one of the most common manifestations of violence is actually intimate partner violence, even in these settings of displacement and conflict. And it's one that hadn't gotten that much attention. And I think it's increasingly getting more attention, but it's still an area that requires more investment, more support. There was a recent World Bank and UNHCR, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, project on the gendered impacts of forced displacement. And it emphasizes that both displacement and conflict independently increase the risks of multiple forms of gender-based violence, including violence within the home or the relationships, like intimate partner violence. And women who experience both displacement and conflict are at highest risk. And this is across multiple settings, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, Liberia, Colombia. They found that women who've been forcibly displaced due to the crisis consistently experience more violence within their homes, And it's important to note that, for example, displacement in Colombia and in Liberia, displacement increased women's odds of intimate partner violence by 40 to 55%. And that's very significant, especially given that, baselines around the world are not low. And then in the Democratic Republic of Congo, women experienced higher levels of violence, both by non-partners and by partners. So these are, really important forms of violence to consider as you're responding to the needs of those affected by a crisis. I want to say one more thing before I talk briefly about some things that need to be done. I just want to highlight that the effects of increased militarization in these conflict-affected settings, including in the Ukraine, where we're seeing, quite an influx of small arms as people arm up to protect their homes and their nation, that these have long-lasting consequences potentially and implications for violence, even after the conflict ends and hopefully people can return to their homes and start. Research shows that men's access to small arms is associated with increased intimate partner violence and with increased violence of that violence. Future efforts to support reconstruction of Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, right? Every country that's experiencing a conflict and displacement should really integrate support for measures to prevent and respond to violence, intimate partner violence and violence within families. Women have to be obviously included in all peace negotiations and in the eventual reconstruction. Policymakers and those working on funding and supporting reconstruction have to consider that violence against women can really persist as a legacy of conflict for many years, and can be a threat to peace, can be a threat to recovery from the conflict. So I have a few thoughts about what's needed. I'm hoping we'll have a chance to talk more about it in the conversation that we have after the interventions, but I think we need to think about both prevention and response. When we're thinking about prevention of violence against those who've been able to flee a conflict, and particularly for those like in the context of the Ukraine conflict, have been able to flee and now settle in urban areas and surrounding countries, we need to consider that the risks that refugees face go beyond just letting them know about where they can seek services, right? There's research by the Women's Refugee Commission that identified that the risks that refugees face when settling in urban areas come from their financial precarity, come from their inability to secure safe housing, and other kind of safe employment and other support that they need to be able to have stability in their new location. So, for example, supporting safe childcare, supporting safe housing access, employment that's not exploitative, that can help reduce risks for refugees in these new contexts. But of course, obviously, access to services is also really, really critical for prevention and for response. It's important to support local actors that have the knowledge and the ability and already are running programs around intimate partner violence and other forms of gender-based violence. But those programs should be made accessible to refugees, and that includes financial access, linguistic access, and research by UNICEF and the Women's Refugee Commission identified the importance of having trained linguistic and cultural mediators, so interpreters and other support workers, to make sure that responses are tailored to and address the needs of people coming into a setting from outside. And then finally, as this situation unfortunately seems to be a long-lasting one, and we know that around the world conflicts, especially complex emergencies, are lasting longer and longer, it's really important to work within the population of refugees and others affected by the crisis to help them design and support their design and implementation of their own prevention and response efforts. There are people with incredible knowledge, motivation within those communities who should be supported to develop the programming that they and their fellow refugees need and want. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chen. Many interesting points regarding the many risks that women as victims of sexual violence face in the context of conflict. Now, one of the panelists here, Leena, has decided instead to focus, nevertheless, on women, on the role of women in conflicts as perpetrators, as combatants. And I thought that it's a perspective that we want to hear from as well, because it can be also, it can contribute to the reflection that we're hoping we can have regarding the efforts to mitigate the risk of women during the conflict and to help survivors in the aftermath. So I will start, Leena, asking you, I think since your angle is, if you allow me, peculiar, maybe you can tell us a bit more with respect to the context of this conference, which focuses much more on the on women as victims. Maybe you can start telling us a bit more about your research and why you think it is important to study the role of women as perpetrators also, not only as victims.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and already we heard such interesting presentations. So it's a pleasure to continue. Yes, that's a very interesting question, and I hope that I can contribute. I can answer to that question in my short introduction now. So my name is Leena Vastapuu. I work as an assistant professor of war studies with the background in international relations, however, but now I work in war studies. I work in the area of gender, peace, and security here at the Swedish Defense University in Stockholm. And for the past 10 years or so, I have been studying women's participation in armed conflicts in general, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa and Liberia. But today, however, I'm going to discuss more about roles of women as perpetrators in general, and not so much in the context of Liberia, because this is the general perspective is probably something that interests us today. So today I want to provide three main arguments. The first one is that women have always participated in war in various kinds of roles. The second one is that we need to stop treating women simply as victims of war. And this might be interesting here. I come back to this. And my third point is that if we embrace and accept the complexity where women and men and boys and girls, people with various gender identities can be victims and perpetrators often simultaneously, if we embrace that complexity, accept that, then we can better target, plan, support to benefit everyone. So let me start with the first argument. So women have always participated in war. Women have participated as captains, as generals, as commanders in chief. So these traditional roles, but they have also participated in support roles in logistics that we don't normally consider as especially in the context of sub-Saharan Africa or global South, we don't consider as real soldiering, but they have been there in the front lines, supporting the forces, so taking care of the troops, informal caretaking tasks. And here we have to understand that without these care duties, the troops couldn't function. So these are also war veterans in the post-war period. So if we take an example, researcher Alexis Henshaw undertook a random sample of 72 non-state armed groups who were active between 1990 and 2008. So 72 different various groups. And what she found out that women were participating to nearly 60% of these conflicts. They had official capacities and unofficial capacities, but they were in direct combat roles. They were in leadership roles. And what is interesting is that most of these women were wanted to be there. They were voluntarily recruited. So if women have participated historically, they are participating all the time, why don't we know about that? Why don't we know about their participation? So I would argue, and I strongly argue that military history in general, media portraits, tendency of media to report on conflicts, our everyday narratives about conflicts, our everyday understanding of war, everything is corrupted with toxic masculinities, militarized masculinities. So what I mean by this is that we have these ideas where Rambo soldiers are saving weak and vulnerable victims. You have masculine warriors, real often white men, and with the stereotype that white men are saving brown women from brown men. So this is the stereotype. So I think we all are a bit part and parcel of this puzzle and this challenge that we don't know about the roles of women in wars. The second one is that, and this relates to the first point, women have always participated in wars, but I strongly argue that we need to stop treating women simply as victims of war. So women are, of course, victims. I definitely don't want to say that they are not. Of course they are. Many of them are. Most of them are. But they can also be, some of them can also be perpetrators. And what is challenging and problematic is that they can be victims and perpetrators simultaneously. So maybe you as a girl, young girl, were recruited forcibly to the front lines. You are, of course, a victim. But maybe after 5 years, you started to commit horrible atrocities yourself. So in addition to victimhood, you are a perpetrator, and so you have this gray area that we would need to recognize. It's not black and white; it's gray. And also, what Chen was also referring to, men and boys can also be victims, of course. And this is something we forget when we talk about gender often. Many men are perpetrators, but some are also victims. The taboo of sexual violence against boys and men in conflict zones is a huge one, such a huge one that we have some research, but we need more. The taboo is extremely persistent, and this includes what is currently happening in Ukraine. So we know that boys and men are victims of sexual violence in Ukraine right now. So I want to make clear, however, that I am not saying that we would need to stop supporting victims of wartime rapes or contesting that most women and most civilian victims of war are women. Certainly that is the case. What I'm saying instead is that simplistic narrative, we would need to abandon the simplistic narratives where women are only as victims, where men are only as perpetrators. Because these kinds of stereotypes are immensely harmful for everyone, because they don't describe accurately the reality of war. So this brings to me to my third and final point. So if we would embrace and accept this complexity, we would be able to provide better support to everyone. So if we take Ukraine, for instance, about 20% of members of the military forces, Ukrainian armed forces, are women. But does the media reflect this reality? I don't think so. If we see women soldiers, we have seen some. We have seen highly sexualized pictures, photographs of women in combat uniforms, wearing lipstick, having their perfectly done nails, so on. This is not the actual reality of war. What is the actual reality of war is that war is ugly, horrible, bloody, it's dirty, it's appalling. So the reality of war is that women are raped, men are raped, boys are raped, girls are raped, of course, and that is ugly and horrible. So if we then, what are the consequences? If we look at the peace negotiation table, as many referred already, there is not a single woman at the moment in Ukraine, in the context of Ukraine. And why is that? I would say that one contributing factor is that the idea is that we need to bring the perpetrators to the peace negotiation table, their representatives, and when war is considered as men's business, this is what is happening. This is one contributing factor. So we have to understand that war is men's business, but war is also women's business. War is everybody's business, and so should be peace, everybody's business. Everybody who is impacted by war. So my final, and this is where I end, my final point is that I would like to ask and make a call for contextual awareness. What do I mean by that? So instead of reflecting what we think we know of war, our perceptions, ideas that come from popular culture, the ideas that come from novels, wherever, instead of reflecting what we think we know, we should look what is really happening on the ground. We should really shut up and listen. We don't know better. People on the ground know better. Civilians who are there in the midst of war, they know better. Soldiers who are there, both men and women, they know better. So we need to shut up, listen their stories of war, and then design the support accordingly. So we need to accept what they are saying, and we need to be more humble and listen. So I end it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leena. I'm sure during the discussion we will come back to your thought-provoking intervention. Both Leena and also Chen before have also suggested or emphasized that men and boys can be victims of sexual violence as well. Just yesterday, the head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine came out with a report after a sort of journey that she took among 14 villages where until the end of March, that were until the end of March under Russian occupation. And the report documents episodes of rape, sexual assault, forced nudity, gang rape sometimes, having been committed against both women and men, boys and girls, although also the commissioner makes clear that these episodes seem to appear to disproportionately affect women. However, she also noticed that in general, there is a tendency to not want to talk about sexual violence and rape, but the individuals, the family, the communities are resistant. There is a wall of silence, and we might even think that the stigma might be even stronger for boys and men. So it's something probably that we should keep in mind when we compare the numbers across the two genders. So now, Lotta, I want to come to you because we have listened to four, I think, very interesting interventions, and you have extensive experience, as I said, as an advocate of women and children rights in different regions of the world, including the Ukraine. So is there any more reflection that you want to add to this panel in addition or even in opposition to what has been said so far? You have to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's always a danger of being the last one in the panel because you get triggered by what other people say. So now I have way too much to say. Anyway, and I thank all of you for actually raising very important issues. So yes, I do have experience from Ukraine quite recently, not during the escalation of the war, though. I do also have experience from, for example, Philippines, where there is, apart from the constant sort of humanitarian situations because of the weather, there's also, or has been, an ongoing internal war in the south for a very long time. So if I start with my sort of SIDA hat and start talking about what we believe is something, and I think that can also be supported by research, and I'm not a researcher, but we do believe that strengthening women's place in society by, for example, working on women's economic empowerment, for example, and someone mentioned access to services. We believe that access to banking, saving, access to trade in an equal way. All of these things strengthen the situation of women, and also in a way, and of course this is a very what can I say, complex process, but it does eventually also affect the norms, the social norms that affect women in society. We also work a lot from SIDA's side on, and this is Swedish SIDA, not Canadian, on, for example, women's political empowerment and participation, which we do believe is also essential for strengthening women's position in countries with or without a conflict. And I do know that, for example, research from Gothenburg's University shows that a prominent victimization of women in conflict. There is also a very strong growing movement of political agency in that particular country, which is, I think, a very interesting finding. And of course, I mean, I think it's a given that we know that sexual violence, gender-based violence is we're talking about power relations. We're talking about the complete and utter falling apart of social norms and social restrictions. And that happens in stressful situations, whether it is conflict or the humanitarian situation because of typhoons or earthquakes or whatever. And that is very much my experience, having been through the world's strongest typhoon in the Philippines, for example. And what we find is that there are measures that can be set up quickly to protect women, and also in a way be a megaphone to say sexual violence is not okay, or even physical violence is not okay. And so UNICEF and other organizations often put up safe spaces for both children and women in a humanitarian situation. And that those safe spaces are places where women can go, they can talk about what's happened, receive trauma treatment, etc. What doesn't happen though, and I thank Leena for bringing this up, is that men don't come there. They are also victims of certain abuse in these very stressful, traumatic situations. Let me give you an example. In the Philippines, in the south, there has, until about 5 years ago, there were very rare occurrences in the conflict, reports of rape or sexual abuse. We attributed it to the fact that in the strongest and biggest Muslim rebel movement, there was a very strong women's auxiliary brigade within the movement, and that prevented the liberation movement from actually committing crimes like that. On the other hand, when UNICEF did a study on sexual, physical, and psychological abuse of children all over the country in the Philippines, it came out that boys were more commonly abused than girls, to everybody's surprise. And of course, women and girls were the ones receiving treatment. And this was without a conflict situation or in a conflict situation. And there was no difference in class, in urban, rural setting, Muslim or Catholic or other religious setting. The statistics showed the same. And so it is very important that we also highlight the fact that boys can, or men can, be abused. However, the stigma is enormous for them to report this and do something about it. So I just wanted to say that. The next thing is, of course, we have to consider, and I'm happy that Chen brought this up, the LGBTQI community, who are often, very often overlooked, ignored, or even shunned, and pretend, everyone pretends nothing happened to them. Well, it did. And so again, and Leena brought this up, you have to be context specific, because if you are context specific, you can see the different patterns that come out. So those are the things that I wanted to bring up in terms of what we've seen. Also, one thing, and I can't remember now who brought that up, but it's important that services provided to those who have been abused are found in one place, one sort of one-stop shop type of approach, so that you don't have to go to the police, then you have to find a doctor or a nurse, and then you have to go to the social services. You have to really overstretch yourself when you have been traumatized. No. It should be one place, and the services should be united there. I also want to say that that there are excellent reports coming out of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in every country, and especially those coming out of Ukraine right now. And the Human Rights Ombudsman in Ukraine is, I think, waging a very brave struggle, and has been for some time, in vocalizing what is happening, both within their own, regiments and so on, but also, of course, what's happening to the population and those who are actually soldiers in the war right now. So she needs all our support, I think, to be able to get together with OHCHR to reveal all this that happens. And the last thing I wanted to bring up is what we try to support a lot from SIDA's side, and mostly in Central Africa, but also in some countries in Asia, is women as peace builders and women as peace negotiators. Women are actors, and I already mentioned the Bangsamoro Women's Brigade in the Philippines, but there are lots of them, and of course, and there are lots of female Ukrainian soldiers as well, and doctors and cooks and whatever they are, and they are actors, but they are also peace builders, and they are also trying to if there is such a thing, make war more human, and sort of keep their humanity in the awful things that are going on. Thank you. That's all for me for now.
Thanks a lot, Lotta. That's a lot. Thank you. Yeah, like you, I actually had prepared some follow-up questions based on what I know is the expertise from each of you, but this reflection stimulated even more questions. And before I actually ask you more questions, I want to see whether also the audience was as stimulated as we have been. So I want to check whether either those of you who are listening to us online or the people who are sitting in this room want to ask any question to any of our panelists. If there is some aspect that they touched on that you would like us to reflect more on. So if you are online, you're welcome to raise your hand. I can see the hands here, but for now we have a Yaroslava in Stockholm.
Thank you very much for this discussion in the panel. I just have a question which is probably on the mind of many people in Ukraine, I guess, and beyond. The question of the role of bringing perpetrators to justice in minimizing, reducing this the impact of violence, and especially, you know, given that Europe had its share of armed conflicts even before Ukraine war, Bosnia, and yeah, I mean, even World War II. I mean, what is the experience there? I mean, given that the justice is a slow process and in some instances is not possible, what are the strategies? How can this, you know, how can the resolution or closure be brought to victims in such circumstances, and whether it is even possible in some cases?
Yes, thank you, Yaroslava. Is there anyone in the panel who would like to with some thoughts on this question? As we think of the transition of justice, what are things that can be done or cannot be done to, as we said at the beginning, make sure that those. Please.
I'm not an expert of Ukraine, but what I know, and others can reconfirm, there is already evidence teams who are searching for evidence, collecting evidence, working there on the ground. So I guess this is the first thing to do, so that for the future possible trials there will be as much evidence as possible. So this is already ongoing and so important, and all the brave organizations and people who are doing that, all my praise to them, but others might know more about this.
Yeah, so WHO and UNOC, Office of Drugs and Crime, sorry, I always get the acronym wrong, have put together a package a few years ago around medical legal processes and evidence collection in humanitarian contexts. I think, you know, in general, it's really important to also consider that not all cases are going to fit within appropriate sort of, you know, the relevant legal categories for violence. So Evidence should only be collected if it can be used and with the full informed consent of the survivor. I think one of the previous speakers already pointed out, for example, that legislation in Ukraine is not conducive to necessarily certain types of prosecutions given disruption to systems and a very short time frame for bringing forward cases. And so I think what's required is an understanding of the legal context, the various forms of violence that may or may not be reportable or prosecutable, and then really provide very clear guidance to service providers so that they don't conduct unnecessary and quite invasive procedures on those who've already experienced violence. As you know, that the evidence collection sometimes unfortunately mirrors the abuse itself, and it's really important to only engage in that practice when it's legally relevant and again, requested or wanted by the survivor.
Thank you very much for your answers. Do we have more questions? I see a hand here. Katerina, do you want to say something?
It's not a question, it's more on access to justice that I wanted to add something. Absolutely. That on the 8th of March of this year, the European Commission proposed a new directive to the European Parliament on violence against women and domestic violence. And it does have a specific section, specific chapter and articles on access to justice. That because it is acknowledged that also in the European Union, access to justice for victims of violence against women in general and domestic violence more specifically faces a number of limitations at the moment, and there is a need to strengthen legislation. This is still at the draft stage. The Parliament has not adopted yet the directive, but I think that it is an important step in terms of strengthening access to justice for victims of violence in Europe.
Thank you, Katerina. So, since I don't see more questions, I want to go back to some of the things that have been said so far and trying to also stimulate a conversation between all of you. One point that Chen has emphasized is the high incidence of intimate partner violence among displaced women. And if, Bilge, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understood this correctly, this is potential in contrast, at least generally speaking, with the research that you mentioned that you have done in Turkey. And if it's not, maybe you can tell us a bit more because it was a bit fast and so probably missed something. If it is, how do you think of this contrasting evidence?
Yeah, thank you so much, Pamela. I think great point. So I had to pass a little bit fast. I think I always end up preparing too many slides. But so in our paper, which came out in Journal of Development Economics in 2021, we actually look at the domestic violence faced by women in the host country. So we have information not on the refugee side because the government actually interviews them, not for domestic violence, like they do like a general survey, just the conditions of living, but they don't share that survey. So we have very little information in case of Turkey about the challenges of the refugee population. They only publish like just the summary statistics report. They don't share the individual data. So essentially what we did in Turkey, we have a specialized survey called the National Survey on Domestic Violence Against Women. And it's similar to the demographic and health surveys that contain, information on domestic violence designed on that, but it has some additional questions to understand domestic violence more specifically. And there we looked at the rounds of 2008 and 2014. So that's before the 2011 Syrian civil war and after the 2011 civil war. So essentially 2008, the pre and the 2014 post periods. And we compared the provinces across time. And we look at the essential placement of Syrian refugees across provinces of Turkey. But we have what's called in economics an instrumental variable strategy. So we predict where refugees go based on the distance in which they enter the country and from where they come from. And we look at essentially using that strategy to see, what happened first to the labor market outcomes of men versus women in the host country. So there's a big debate, as you know, about whether refugee populations displace native groups at all. And in Turkey, the findings are a bit mixed. So essentially, they displace in the informal population, but in the informal sector. But in the formal sector, they can even be complements. So there's research that actually shows that the entry of all these informal workers, they reduce costs in some sectors, such that actually the formal employment, especially for men and for skilled workforce, actually gets boosted in return for those refugee inflows. But for us, we are concerned for the relative employment of men versus women. And what we found was that actually the relative employment of women declined in places where refugees got in more, because they tended to displace women more in the sectors that women work intensively and women work informally. So there's a huge displacement in agriculture, for example, where a lot of the work used to be done by women. And then in return for this relative employment changes, what we can find is that actually domestic violence that Turkish women reported experiencing declined in those places that are more differentially affected. And that's essentially consistent with this idea that initially they were facing more violence because they challenged the gender norms in places that they worked, and they had income that men used violence for extraction. And once they stopped working, actually the violence rates decline. So that's consistent with other work that we have done that shows that economic empowerment actually tends to actually trigger more violence. So here, in this case, it leads to economic disempowerment, and that tends to reduce violence. But I agree with the point Chen has made. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, as well as some small surveys from refugee populations that show the prevalence of risk of domestic violence, and it is quite high. And mostly because bargaining power of these women are even much lower compared to before where they came from. So
your findings are about the local populations.
I'm findings about the local population.
Although I guess the idea that also the refugee women are instead, are more exposed to intimate partner violence is still a bit in contrast with your finding. If we think of economic hardship being the driver, which confirms the mixed result also from the literature that depending on the context, the population, more economic security could lead to more or less intimate partner violence. Yes, so another point that I think we touched on a couple of times is this differences in the exposure to sexual violence or the incidence of sexual violence during the conflict. And Chen has actually written an article that discusses this, the way we talk about this. The title, I think, is quite informative. It says from it never happens to it's mostly men or something along those lines. So, Chen, do you want to maybe tell us a bit more also in light of what emerged from this discussion regarding the gender differences in the way the conflict affects women and men?
Yeah, and thank you for that opportunity. I put the link to the article, which is an open source, so it's available without any institutional access needed, to the article, which is from It Rarely Happens to It's Worse for Men. It's co-authored by quite a large number of us who've been working on issues to do with sexual violence and conflict, including with men, boys, and people of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression in these settings. And it really tries to sort of encompass what we currently know, which we all acknowledge is not as much as we know about violence against women and girls, and also to try to dispel some of the key myths. And I want to address two of them, which I think are quite critical here, especially if we're thinking about the Ukraine context, but more generally. One is in the title, right, that it's worse for men. And we highlight that even though that's often the narrative, right, that the stigma is greater for men and that it's potentially the consequences are greater. That's not what the research tells us, right? The research tells us that, again, context specific, there may be some variation, but in general, the stigma is so significant and potentially kind of devastating, and with really significant consequences to the lives of those who experience violence, based on a variety of factors, and that gender is not necessarily the most important one, right? And that women and girls also face significant consequences from associated with the stigma. For example, young girls might be forced to marry the person who raped them in order to save family honor, and that is incredibly devastating to their lives and quite limiting in their ability to sort of achieve all that they can achieve as individuals. So I want to just kind of dispel that misconception. I mean, I think it's not a competition of who has it worse. It's horrible for everyone. And I think we need to recognize, as Leena noted, sort of the complexity of these situations, and really be thoughtful about it. Now, men the second thing I want to highlight is around service access and availability. It's true that most services that are available in these settings are geared specifically towards women. And that's because you can't just sort of provide the same service to everyone. Women do, as far as we still know, and there hasn't been any data to dispel this yet, women make up the majority of those who are in need of services. And so most of the programs that organizations will put out for survivors will be aimed at women and girls in particular, although obviously there are some that might be focused on other parts of the population. However, there are in general, kind of men seek services less than women in general. And that's something that's important to sort of consider as you design services for men and making them accessible to men in ways that are safe for them. The other thing that I want to say is that services are incredibly underfunded and access is lacking for everyone in these settings. Things may be a little bit different in the Ukraine situation, where refugees are fleeing into countries that have more established service access. But in general, those who are fleeing conflict around the world find themselves unable to access the needed services, regardless of their gender. There was a study that was done a couple of years ago looking at funding for gender-based violence, humanitarian funding for gender-based violence services, and they found that less than 0.1% of 0.1%, right? Less than 0.1%, if I am not mistaken, of humanitarian funding was for gender-based violence services. And that is, and humanitarian funding is already significantly less than development funding, right? And most humanitarian crises are severely underfunded in terms of the needs that are put forward by the system. The second thing to consider is that in that same study, and in other studies, they found that a significant number of the programs and projects that humanitarian organizations want to provide around gender-based violence, and that includes everything from health service provision to psychosocial support to working on social norms within communities to legal support, that I think about 2/3 of those programs weren't funded at all. And so again, there's this deprioritization, which I spoke about earlier, this sort of notion that this can wait, that this is not an urgent need. And that means, what that ends up meaning is that almost nobody has the kind of access that they need. That's actually what my PhD was on, to services for gender-based violence. And so again, I think what we need to be thinking about is, rather than looking at this opposition of like, do women have it better than men or have it worse than men, we need to really embrace this notion that if we are to support the needs of people affected by crisis, if we are to help to build a more safe and secure and stable future for those who come from places that have experienced these crises, that we need to really focus on providing these critical services for everyone, that we need to look at the complexity and the specificity of particular situations and really put together responses with local actors and the affected population that respond to the relevant needs, without it becoming this sort of, I don't know, battle of the genders, which I think is not a helpful approach and not one that results in what we want to see happen.
Thank you very much, Chen. And I think you in part answer already the question that I would like to ask all of you in the just to answer quickly in the 4 minutes that we have left. So I will be 1 minute for each of you. Just maybe if based on your expertise and also this discussion, if there is one policy or intervention that you would like to see being implemented in the current situation, referring to the risk that women face in this conflict. Is there anything that you would want to propose? And feel free to say, not really, because we don't know enough about this. I take that as an answer. Yes, Leena, you can start.
I would like to see a very properly, carefully designed and implemented baseline study. So not these quick impact assessments, but a correct, good baseline study to which the policy interventions could then be based upon.
Very good, thank you, Leena. Bilge, I think you also wanted to weigh in.
Yes, thank you so much, Pamela. So, I mean, I think for domestic violence specifically, what we have seen during COVID-19 at least is that when access to like police or other centers, like or even safe spaces that was mentioned, is difficult for women in conflict. I mean, in some cases, the call centers can be helpful. Of course, you might think, I mean, even in worst cases, even the phones don't work. But I mean, I just think that sometimes it's even harder to like physically go to a place, right? So sometimes just getting some advice over the phone, to the extent that phones work, can be useful. And I think in the US, at least, like during this COVID-19, there was a huge jump in the hotline calls, and actually access to police had gone down. And I think that can be partly like a substitute in the conflict situation. In addition, I think access to overall like mental health services can be useful when we think about domestic violence.
Thank you, Bilge. Katerina?
Thank you so much.
What I said before, but very much also on Leena's response, that improved data availability would be my recommendation, and that would help us design more appropriate ways to support victims. And they should be comprehensive and capture the different ways within which women are affected, as we discussed throughout this panel discussion, because women are not only victims and victims are not only women. Thank you.
And I just want to say, I mean, and I don't want to contradict Leena and Katerina on this, but one of the, sort of agreed notions within the humanitarian service provision is that you don't wait to have the data to provide the services. And so I think it's not really a contradiction per se, but it's really important to make sure that we don't, pause the service provision or neglect to sort of address the known needs and utilize good practices while waiting for this sort of the good gold standard data collection processes, which we know are not quick, take time, take resources to do properly. And so it's just important to make sure that we are responding to immediate needs and providing access to all those who are affected in ways that are appropriate for them.
Thank you very much.
I completely agree, Chen.
Thank you. And of course, then on top of the question of what should be done, there is the question of the political will, as someone from the audience suggested before. But we are right on time, and we're going to have a much needed coffee break, given that this is a long day and we still have a couple more presentations. So I thank all of you very much for this very interesting discussion. And